Hello fellow collectors, I hope you are doing wonderfully well. Today in this video I kick off a new series on my channel where I talk about a certain actor or director and then 3 of their films. Now this isn't necessarily what I think are their 3 best films or most important, but merely ones that have been on my mind recently that I'd like to either see for the first time or to revisit. And today we're kicking things off with the excellent Frances McDormand. It just so happens that over the last couple of months I've picked up 3 of her films that I wanted to revisit, and that's what gave me the idea for this series. McDormand is of course a stellar actor, having won the Oscar for Best Actress no less than 3 times, which is simply an astonishing feat. She's probably best known for her collaboration with her husband, Joel Coen, who is one half of the Coen brothers, having appeared in several of their films. But of course she has made some incredible films outside that collaboration too, such as last year's Women Talking, or Almost Famous. And much to my delight she's appeared so far in 3 of Wes Anderson's films, and here's hoping she'll appear in many more. Well, of the 3 films of hers that I'll talk about today, it just so happens randomly that these are actually the films that she won an Oscar for. But I've seen all of these only once before, so it was really great to revisit them and see whether my initial impressions had changed. And so, without any further ado, let's talk about the first one here, 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. From 2017 and directed by Martin McDonagh, it stars, of course, Frances McDormand, as well as Woody Harrelson, Peter Dinklage, Sam Rockwell, Abbie Cornish and Caleb Landry Jones. Such an incredible cast for this film. For whatever reason, it being on my mind recently is one I'd like to revisit, as I don't think I'd seen it since it came out. And I managed to grab this absolutely lovely edition from the Wheat collection, which I picked up from Yuki Palo, which is a great resource if you've ever missed out on any lovely South Korean editions. This film is brutal. It's the story of a mother who lives in a small town, whose daughter was savagely murdered, and yet the police still haven't found who did it, despite it being many months. And she's grown tired of not hearing from them and from their seeming inaction. And when she comes across 3 disused billboards, she decides to put them to good use. This was a film which elegantly balances the serious and brutal nature of the story with a surprising amount of humour which was incredibly interesting to watch. This is really a devastatingly sad tale which touches on areas of grief and loss, on domestic violence, on police brutality, on family breakdown and struggles, and also on the idea of the loss of hope. And so to intertwine that with some hilariously funny scenes, well, I'm just not sure how McDonagh, who both wrote and directed this, was able to do it, and to make it work as seamlessly as it does here. I guess you could call it a dark comedy, but despite the humour, I'm not sure that would be totally accurate. And after watching some of the extras, it was really interesting to hear him say that he wanted to keep a rein on the comedy and make sure that the sadness, loss and struggle against the hopelessness of the situation maintained itself tonally all the way through. And well, I think he absolutely nailed that aspect. Frances McDormand is simply superb in her role here. She plays this brilliant balance of grief and heart-wrenching sadness, but also fierce determination, and she has this ironclad will. Yet with all that, she also manages to carry this vulnerability to her character as well. She is someone that is up against it in almost every direction that she turns, and it feels like one woman against the world. Just a stunningly layered performance from her, as she conveys so much with so little, and there are a couple scenes where her emotion erupts, and it is absolutely crushing to watch. It was interesting because as the film starts, you feel like it has maybe a little air of a western about it. Just the musical score, the small town setting, it has these little elements which give you that sort of feeling. And on one of the extras, McDormand actually says that she was a big fan of John Wayne, particularly in John Ford's films, and she modelled the physicality of her character in some ways on John Wayne, like in the gait of her walk and how she moved. Now, I do think the film has a couple flaws, and mostly it's leaving plot threads unresolved. Peter Dinklage's character, for example, just felt like a useful plot device, a handy tool to be used to progress the story in a certain direction, and that did feel slightly contrived to me, so I would have liked to have seen more of him so that his role felt more natural. Also, I would have liked to see more from the Chief of Police, played by Woody Harrelson, his family in particular. Some sort of wrap-up of their storyline I think should have been included. but perhaps those were done on purpose. There is a thread which runs throughout this film regarding a lack of answers. I mean, we always want a resolution, we always want things tied up nicely, but life just isn't like that. And so it is stretching it a little bit, but perhaps he did purposefully leave some threads untied so as to kind of reinforce that. But to be honest, I think it was probably just to not make the story too long. Overall though, a very moving, very affecting, deeply sad and tough watch at times, but a brilliant one, filled with superb performances. And of course, how could I talk about Three Billboards without mentioning Sam Rockwell, who plays Officer Dixon, a character that you absolutely hate, and yet that you somehow start to root for. I think a real testament to his incredible acting ability and Martin McDonagh's excellent writing. Absolutely excellent stuff. Next up, and we have Fargo. From 1996 and directed by Joel Cohen, of course written by Joel and Ethan Cohen. It stars, of course, again, Frances McDormand, as well as Steve Buscemi, Peter Stormare, William H. Macy, Harvey Presnell and John Carroll Lynch. Now, it's probably been about 10 years since I last saw this one, and unfortunately I remember I just didn't like it. I didn't care for it at the time. And actually, I remember being particularly disappointed because I knew it was held in such high regard. But sadly, I can't really remember any of my thoughts much beyond that. Thankfully though, I am delighted to say that upon revisiting this, I absolutely loved it. I thought it was fantastic. Here we have a pitch black comedy that is consistently amusing, despite the gruesome and criminal goings on, so it actually has quite a lot in common with Three Billboards. Our story follows a regular family man who needs some money, and so through a series of contacts through friends of friends, he manages to hire a couple criminals to kidnap his wife and hold her for ransom, which her very rich father would be able to pay. No one gets hurt, a rich man gets just a little poorer, the wife returns safe and sound, and he gets to finance what he is so desperate for. It sounds simple enough, right? Well, of course, absolutely not. The bodies start to pile up, and as a result, Frances McDormand, who plays the pregnant police chief of the small town of Brainerd, starts to investigate. There was this wonderful, light-hearted, "yeah, sure, you betcha" kind of dialogue, which was consistently excellent here, with even a darn tooting thrown in. The people from this small town just seem to take things as they are, no matter how outrageous or shocking. It's just all in a day's work. They take it all in their stride. And no matter what is said, no matter how devastating or bleak, everyone seems to say this jovial, "real good then," to end their sentences, and it just cracked me right up. McDormand here is again, of course, great, and has some particularly brilliant mini reactions to things that really made me laugh. There's an instance where a character unexpectedly drives away from her, and she's left in an empty office and says to no one, "He's fleeing the interview, he's fleeing the interview," and she does this little double take movement which is pure gold. And also when she is later pointing her gun at a guy, with a lot of noise going on in the background, and she's shouting, "It's the police," but obviously he can't hear her because of the noise, and then he looks at her. She shouts it again, of course, to no effect. But then she does this hilarious pointing to the badge which is on her hat, along with this momentary facial expression. Just geniusly comic. These little touches that she added really made me crack up. McDormand plays this character who is such a good egg, and she's just a perfect juxtaposition to the wider story of kidnapping and multiple murders, all in such a seemingly happy place. At least for the people living there, because to outsiders it's just a cold, snowy nothingness. And these people's mellifluous accent makes it seem like nothing can faze them and nothing could ever get them down. There's just a wonderful balance that this film strikes which works so well, and is a real testament to the great writing of the Coen brothers. Another great thing about this film is all the misdirection it employs. I think the epitome of them is one that was entirely superfluous to the story, and yet somehow pure brilliance and hilarity, which is this almost insane meeting of her old classmate, who after seeing her on TV, calls her up out of the blue and suggests a catch-up, and then he gives her this wild sob-story tale after not seeing her for years. It's just the most random, seemingly needless scene, but also just perfect in some way, and I'm so glad I'd forgotten about it. I will say though, despite McDormand winning Best Actress for her role here and William H. Macy being nominated for Best Supporting Actor, if anything I would have thought it would have been the other way around, with her supporting and him being the main character. Indeed, if there even was a main character here, because really we have a story with three components. We have the cop, the culprit and the criminals, and to me it seemed like all their stories were of course woven together, but they were given a fairly similar amount of screen time. Nothing really that important, but just something I found a little odd. Overall though, I thought this was a great work, which manages to blend these disturbingly dark situations and yet keep them feeling really quite light and even at times absurdly funny. It is a fantastic achievement and I'm so glad that I revisited this one, as my thoughts have pretty much done a 180. I'll also just quickly say that I thought the 4K from Shout Factory looked fantastic, so I'm really glad that I forked out to import it from the States. And lastly we have Nomadland, from 2020 and directed by Chloe Zhao, and we have actually a very small group of professional actors here, the big two really just being Frances McDormand and David Strathairn, and really most of the supporting characters here are all real people, many of whom actually live this lifestyle. We have a story here about a woman who used to live in a small town, where most of the work came from one company and their local factory. She had a husband who worked there, she had a house, a relatively normal life, until that company had to downsize and they shut the local factory, and because of that, pretty much the entire town had to disband. We learn as well that her husband had passed away at some point, and so she finds herself alone and adrift and with almost nothing, and so decides to take up the van lifestyle. We first meet her when she's already been living in her van for some time and driving around following the seasonal work, like an Amazon warehouse at Christmas and a campsite during the summer. I think a big strength of this film is how it makes you incredibly introspective. You can't help but start to think about your own life and choices and the paths that you've taken. And it also reminded me of something that I think about fairly often, which is that we are all not much more from one bad day away from being homeless. If a bank fails, if there's a natural disaster, if there's just a catastrophe of some kind, who knows where we would find ourselves within the space of just 24 hours. And I think it's a really good reminder to be so thankful for all the things that we have and that we take for granted, like a roof over our head, a few pounds in the bank, a job, even running water or a working toilet. Because through no fault of her own, McDormand's character, who is called Fern, through circumstances entirely out of her control, finds herself alone and with extremely limited options. Again, McDormand is absolutely superb in her role here. She carries with her this sense of loss just beneath the surface, and you sense this enduring grief of her character from everything that she's lost, not least of which was of course her husband. But you also feel her resilience, her desire to keep going as best she can, and of what this life starts to mean to her. I think this could be a great double feature with Leave No Trace, which is a story about a man and his daughter who live out in nature where he just cannot live in civilization. He has this compulsion that he can't overcome to live a certain way out of society. And while it's certainly not as strong here with Fern as in that movie, there are some hints at a compulsion from her to live differently, or maybe to make different choices than usual, one that maybe she's always had. But there is also a really powerful scene where she sort of makes that decision for good, that the van life is now something she has to do and that she wants to do. This is it for her now. There's also a really wonderful aspect to this film which shows the value of community. As she goes up to this meetup where so many people living this lifestyle all come together, where each one, no matter their story that has led them to living a van life, finds strength and encouragement with like-minded people. There are several touching moments where they have this communal get-together and they break bread together, they sing, they listen to advice and just share what they have. It's really quite a beautiful thing. And as I mentioned at the beginning about the film using real people, I think this is also a real get-together that happens. The main chap who is talking and sharing his advice and thoughts really does have a YouTube channel where he does this. I think this is a film which also has a lot to say about getting older, particularly in America. The film itself is actually based off a book by Jessica Bruder, which explored the phenomenon of older people who started living in this nomadic way after the recession in 2007 to 2009. And from conversations in the film, you get the idea that many have been forced into this, much like McDormand's character. There's a powerful conversation between Fern and a lady called Linda May, where she says, "So I was getting close to 62, and I went online to check my social security benefits. It said $550. Fern, I have worked my whole life. I've worked since I was 12 years old, raised 2 daughters. I couldn't believe it." I mean, it sounds unbelievable, but sadly, I think it's true. And yet, despite those brutal circumstances, there is just this zest for life and a positivity that these people cultivate. There is another lady that talks about living life now, not leaving it all at some workplace or some office before you have a chance to explore and experience the joys of freedom and nature, and seeing the things you always wanted to before it's too late. And also that you can do it without tons of money. Lack of money doesn't mean lack of living. Overall, this was a beautifully shot and constructed tale from the great writer and director Chloe Zhao, featuring an absolutely stellar performance from Frances McDormand. This is really a film that will make you think and feel very deeply. Well, that brings us to the end of the video and my thoughts about these 3 fantastic films featuring great performances from Frances McDormand. She is of course an incredible actor that has consistently delivered excellent performances over decades. And if you're interested in seeing her origins as well as those of the Coen brothers, I can highly recommend watching Blood Simple, which is her first film from 1984. Well, that's everything from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.